Dogman Declassified, the latest book from W.J. Brendel, Ph.D. Real reports. Consistent patterns, no clear answers. Take a closer look at the evidence. Available now.
Welcome to Forever Paranormal, where shadows remember and silence has a way of speaking. I'm Dr. Bill, your guide through the strange and the unexplainable.
And I'm Deb. Every week we dig into what hides between belief and proof. Cryptids, hauntings, witchcraft, UFO sightings, and the stories people swear are true.
We don't tell you what to believe. We just look at what's possible, what's been witnessed, and what refuses to stay quiet.
If you like what we do, follow, rate, and share the show. It helps keep the lights on.
And if you want to go deeper, step inside the crypt. Patreon members get the show ad-free a full day early and gain access to our entire archives, years of investigations, bonus episodes, and conversations we don't release anywhere else. You can join at foreverparanormal.com or by searching Forever Paranormal The Crypt on Patreon.
And remember that you're never alone. If you ever need someone to talk to, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is 988.
During Hurricane Katrina, thousands of people vanished, of course temporarily in the floodwater and stuff, evacuation systems, shelters, hospitals, and bureaucratic confusion. But years later, some survivors would claim the storm was not the only thing moving through New Orleans. Welcome back to Forever Paranormal, where we know Natinak is more than a myth and where the veil is thin. Ghosts walk beside us, strange craft drift above us, and creatures move just out of sight. Every story is a door between worlds, and this week we step through into the flooded aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where disaster, fear, rumor, and the paranormal may have blurred together in ways people still argue about today. Hi there, Deb B.
Hi.
Did you have a good week this week?
Yes, I suppose. How about you?
Oh, yeah, it's always a nice week. I'm still on the right side of the dirt, so
Right.
What kind of news do you have for us this week?
On May 18th, 2026, it was reported that the Pentagon released a fresh update on the next batch of UFO files,
Yeah, they did.
with the Unexplained Mysteries Forum noting that documents regarding the Majestic 12 organization may hold more merit than previously thought. Today in the news, the focus remains on UFO secret files and drone swarms, with some experts focusing on nuclear-linked sightings and ongoing investigations into UAP intercepts around North America.
Yeah, I've got a few comments on that.
Please.
Yeah, Deb, I've read some of those files, and I've read a lot about what some of the so-called experts have got to say about them. As far as Majestic 12, yeah, I always kind of figured that was pretty much true because there were files through all the years it was leaked. And, one of the things that came out of those files was Maelstrom Air Force Base, where supposedly the UFO came down and stopped all the missiles, right? Well, supposedly, in these files is a document that says that was actually an EMP test by the U.S. government, and they didn't tell the people at Maelstrom or anybody else. They let them go ahead and do their misguided information of, hey, it was UFOs. But supposedly that was actually a test that the U.S. didn't want Russia to know they had the capability of doing. So I'm curious to see what else comes out of those things.
Well, I think Katrina is one of those events that feels abnormal even before you add anything paranormal to it.
Yeah, I have to agree because we watch that, on TV all the time, seeing what's going on. And honestly, to me, that's exactly what makes these stories different from any kind of normal UFO claims, right? Because Katrina already broke people psychologically. And I don't mean that critically. I mean the environment itself became disorienting in a way most people never experience. There was no power, there was no kind of communications, flood water was everywhere, bodies being recovered from the flood water, families were separated from each other, didn't even know where one was, right? People stranded on rooftops for days, not knowing if any help was actually coming at all. That kind of environment changes perception and maybe even memory. So, before we even touch the UFO side of this, Deb, I think it's important to say something very clearly here. Trauma absolutely shapes how people experience and remember events. And honestly, if somebody told me every strange Katrina story came from exhaustion, fear, confusion, dehydration, darkness, and emotional shock, I think that's a completely reasonable explanation. But I also understand why some survivors walked away convinced they experienced something stranger than that, because it might be reasonable, but it's not plausible.
Once reality starts breaking down around people, it seems normal for rumors to spread really fast.
Yeah, very fast. Especially when nobody knows what's happening from 1 hour to the next, like those people were going through. And that's one thing people who didn't live through Katrina sometimes forget. Communication systems basically collapsed in almost every part of the city. I mean, phones stopped working. Emergency responses became very chaotic, if you can get a boat down there. And people disappeared into shelters or evacuation routes with no way to contact family members. So during those first days, nobody had a clear picture of anything, right? The confusion matters because rumors thrive in information vacuums. Some of those rumors were completely grounded in reality. Yeah, you had military movement, rescue helicopters flying everywhere, missing persons, you had unidentified bodies floating down the flooded streets, and a lot of government confusion. But mixed into all of that were even stranger stories too. We're talking about lights hovering silently over flooded streets. Aircraft people claimed that had no sound at all. They weren't even normal. Stories about missing time during evacuation. And people insisting certain helicopters behaved in ways they couldn't explain. Now, whether those stories reflected actual anomalous events or simply the psychological atmosphere of the disaster is where the conversation starts to get complicated.
Honestly, I think people underestimate how eerie New Orleans probably looked after dark during all of that.
Yeah, I don't think most people can fully picture it unless they saw it firsthand. We've been to New Orleans, and even with all the lights on, it can be a little freaky in certain places at times, right? But you have to remember that there were large sections of the city where almost they were completely blacked out, right? There was no normal city glow. There was no traffic signals, no lit buildings. It was just floodwater reflecting moonlight with distant sirens, generators, and occasional helicopters overhead. And on top of that, you had people sitting in that darkness for hours, staring into the sky, waiting for rescue, hopefully. I mean, that environment alone almost feels surreal. And once people enter surreal environments, strange interpretations start happening naturally. Sometimes that becomes folklore. Sometimes it becomes conspiracy theories. And sometimes paranormal experiences people swear were real for the rest of their lives. That's part of what makes Katrina such an unusual case to examine.
New Orleans already has this reputation for being haunted or spiritually heavy, even without Katrina.
Yeah, it does. And I think that absolutely shaped how people interpreted what they experienced afterwards, because certain places matter psychologically too. I mean, New Orleans already carried decades of folklore before the storm ever arrived. There was ghost tours like we went on, voodoo history, voodoo shops we've been to, above ground cemeteries we've been to, stories about spirits tied to certain neighborhoods. So when Katrina transformed the city into something almost apocalyptic looking, people naturally filtered that experience through the emotional identity the city already had. I mean, honestly, some of the descriptions survivors gave after dark sound terrifying, even without anything paranormal attached to them. Think about it. Floodwaters stretching block after block, no electricity. Military vehicles trying to move through intersections. People stranded on rooftops calling for help. Bodies floating in the water. That alone is enough to alter somebody's sense of reality.
Which may explain why some of these UFO stories stuck afterward.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where people need to resist oversimplifying things in either direction, because some paranormal researchers immediately jump to the storm created cover for non-human activity. Then you have skeptics that immediately jump to these were just trauma-induced rumors. But we know real life is usually messier than that. Some stories probably were misunderstandings. Some may have been distorted over time. And some were likely fueled by online conspiracy culture afterwards. But I also think some witnesses sincerely experienced moments they could not personally explain. And sincerity matters even when certainty doesn't exist. One detail that appears repeatedly in Katrina accounts is silence. Not just the lack of lights, but the silence. People describing aerial movement without the expected helicopter sounds. Now, to be fair, sound behaves strangely during storms and over water. I mean, distant perception changes too. Stress affects sensory processing. There are completely rational reasons somebody might misinterpret aircraft behavior in those conditions. But then again, once enough people repeat similar details, the stories start reinforcing each other culturally. I mean, that's how folklore forms in real time.
That's a good point, because sometimes people act like folklore means fake, when really it usually means communities trying to process something emotionally.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Deb. And honestly, Katrina may be one of the clearest modern examples of that happening publicly. People were trying to make emotional sense of an event that completely overwhelmed normal reality. And when people go through catastrophic situations, stories naturally emerge around the edges of the trauma, right? Sometimes those stories are symbolic. Sometimes they're exaggerated, sometimes only partially true, but sometimes they're rooted in genuine, unexplained experiences. The hard part is figuring out where one category stops and another begins. One woman later described sitting on a rooftop after dark with several other stranded residents while floodwaters covered the streets below them. According to her account, they watched a pale light move slowly across the neighborhoods before stopping completely over the water. I mean, it had no spotlight. There was no visible rotor movement. No sound she could remember hearing at all. Now, obviously, there are possible explanations. You have things like military aircraft, distance distortion, exhaustion, low visibility, and misidentification under extreme stress. And honestly, if somebody told me that was the explanation, I couldn't argue with them. But the woman herself remained convinced years later that what she saw was not a normal helicopter. To me, that's the part of these kind of stories that linger, right? It's not proof, it's conviction of the people who witnessed it.
It feels like Katrina became its own mythology while people were still living it.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, large-scale disasters do something strange to human memory. People don't just remember facts afterwards, they remember emotional fragments. They remember sound, glimpses of something they may have caught, half understood moments that felt important at the time, but never fully settled into place afterwards. And Katrina, well, that created the perfect environment for that. Think about what people were experiencing psychologically. I mean, many of the survivors had not slept properly in days. Some were dehydrated. Some had watched people die. Some genuinely believed they may not survive themselves. I mean, the normal structure people rely on to orient their reality was collapsing hour by hour. And when people enter prolonged states of fear and uncertainty, perception changes. And you know what? Time changes too. Anybody who has lived through severe trauma will tell you memory stops behaving normally. I mean, certain moments become hyper detailed while entire stretches completely disappear. And conversations blur together, sounds feel amplified, so the brain starts prioritizing survival over coherent narrative. That's important because missing time reports, distorted perception, heightened emotional imprinting, those things can emerge naturally during extreme events without requiring anything paranormal at all. But at the same time, that psychological instability, well, it also creates an environment where generally unusual experiences become much harder to evaluate cleanly afterwards. And honestly, I think that uncertainty is what keeps Katrina tied to paranormal discussions years later. Not because people conclusively prove something happened, because the disaster itself permanently damaged people's confidence in what they experienced and what they remembered. And sometimes even what was real around them during those days.
That may be scarier than the UFO angle itself.
Yeah, I think for a lot of survivors it probably was, Deb. That's a good point. Because long after the floodwater receded, many people were still trying to emotionally organize what happened to them during the storm. And when somebody experiences something they cannot fully explain during a moment of extreme trauma, that memory tends to stay open emotionally instead of closing neatly over time. I mean, people had to move across different states after this. And that's part of why these stories survive. Not necessarily because they were factual in every detail, because they became attached to one of the most psychologically disorienting disasters in modern American history.
Do you think the internet made these stories grow larger than they otherwise would have?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I think that's one of the most important parts of this entire topic, right? This entire story here, because Katrina happened right as online forums, message boards, and early digital conspiracy culture were exploding. So instead of strange stories just staying local, like down there, people from completely different areas started comparing experiences online almost immediately afterwards. One person describes a silent light. Another remembers something similar near a shelter site, while somebody else talks about missing time during an evacuation. And once enough people start connecting stories together, patterns begin forming whether the events are actually related or not. You still have the pattern. That doesn't automatically make the stories false, by the way, but it does mean people being influenced, each other's memories, and interpretation was very quickly changed. And honestly, UFO culture has always worked that way to some extent. I mean, we know people recognize familiar patterns like lights and missing time and electrical interference, strange silences, and feelings of disorientation. And once those elements appear, the mind naturally starts placing experiences into existing frameworks. That's just human behavior, Deb.
And Katrina had real disappearances happening at the same time, which probably made all of it even more emotionally charged.
Yeah, that's true. And that's probably what makes this topic so delicate, right? Because people generally went missing during Katrina. Some were later found alive, some sadly were not. Some families spent weeks not knowing whether loved ones had escaped the city, drowned, reached shelters, or ended up in another state entirely. I mean, the confusion was real. So when paranormal rumors started attaching themselves to disappearances, things became emotionally complicated very fast. And honestly, I think that's important to stay careful here because there's a difference between discussing survivor experiences and accidentally turning a real human disaster into entertainment mythology. And that line matters to me. At the same time, though, some of the stories survivors shared do overlap very strongly with older UFO encounter patterns. Missing time is probably the clearest example. One man later posted an account claiming he had become separated from others while moving through a flooded industrial section of the city during some very heavy rain. According to him, he noticed what he first assumed was a helicopter like descending behind some damaged warehouse buildings. But he said something felt wrong almost immediately. There was no sound. No searchlights were sweeping the area, just this pale bluish glow lowering slowly through the storm. Now right there, skeptics are probably already thinking, all right, storm confusion, exhaustion, possible head trauma, shock, sleep deprivation. And honestly, those are very legitimate possibilities. But according to the account, he suddenly felt disoriented and detached from his surroundings. The next thing he clearly remembered was sitting several blocks away after daylight had already started breaking through the clouds. I mean, there was hours missing, no memory of moving at all, and no clear understanding of how he got there. And whether somebody believes that literally happened the way he described it or not, the structure of the story mirrors classic missing time reports almost perfectly.
That may be why these stories connected so strongly to UFO culture afterward.
Yeah, exactly. And because even people with only casual interest in UFO cases recognize these patterns immediately. When you start talking about isolation and strange lights and disorientation with memory gaps and silence and some kind of electrical weirdness maybe, I mean, these elements have existed in abduction narratives for decades. Now, whether that means something genuinely anomalous occurred during Katrina or whether survivors unconsciously interpreted traumatic experiences through familiar cultural frameworks, well, it's still completely open. And honestly, I think both possibilities deserve consideration before people rush to certainty of either one. I mean, one thing that keeps surfacing in Katrina discussions years later is the darkness itself. I mean, people underestimate how visually different this city became. Modern cities almost never go fully dark anymore. We're constantly surrounded by electrical glow. We got traffic lights, signs, buildings, headlights, reflections everywhere. And Katrina stripped much of that away at once. So now, imagine sitting outside for hours, staring upward, waiting for rescue while helicopters passed overhead. And they were continuously moving through the storm clouds and smoke and rain. Even normal aircraft would start looking strange under these conditions. And yet, some witnesses still insisted certain things they saw did not behave like helicopters at all.
Wasn't there also a lot of military activity in the area at that time?
Oh yeah, huge amounts. Military helicopters, you had National Guard operations, you had rescue aircraft, federal response teams. The skies were full of activity when the levees failed, right? Which again gives skeptics the very reasonable explanation of a lot of these sightings. But again, some witnesses described aircraft that allegedly hovered too steadily in bad weather. Others claimed certain objects moved without sound or accelerated unusually fast once they began moving again. Now, personally, I think caution is really important there because memory changes over time, especially after traumatic events. People will retell stories and the details will sharpen and narratives evolve. I mean, that happens naturally. But I also understand why some survivors never fully shook that feeling that they saw something they couldn't explain during those nights trapped in that city. And honestly, I think that emotional residue is part of why Katrina UFO stories never fully disappeared online. Not because they were proven, but because they remained unresolved. Well, at least until next time when we discuss another tale yet to be told. Thanks for listening to Forever Paranormal. Follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find us and keeps the stories coming. Step inside the crypt for archive and exclusive episodes at foreverparanormal.com. And keep up with my latest books and research at wjbrendel.com. And until next time, remember, the veil is always thinner than you think.